did the work, you got the diagnosis, or realized how your brain works. You started peeling back the layers of a self you built to survive. And then something shifts in your relationships, and you don't really understand what or why. Tension emerges because now you're someone who cancels plans without guilt, who says, I can't do that, who needs rest instead of constantly performing warmth. And those choices can make you look like a villain. Hey, I'm Dr. Regina Ph.D., and this is Divergent Paths, the podcast where we unpack the lived experiences of late diagnosed neurodivergent adults. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter, Nerd Notes, where I share even more tips for making your unique brain feel like home. The link is in the show description. This episode is for those moments after the diagnosis, after you start the process of realizing you've been performing, and what it's like to repair relationships at this time. The first thing you really need to do at this point, right? This is a few steps into the process, right? Where you got the diagnosis, or you realized, or you identified yourself as neurodivergent, and you start the process of measuring your capacity and working within it instead of overreaching your energy levels and your reserves because you are capable of doing so much more, right? So you're starting this process of taking away the layers of the self you built to protect yourself. The mask that you are carrying, that you are performing, felt like you to everyone in your life. It felt like you to you too, right? Like I've said before. I didn't think I was masking at all. I thought, thank goodness this isn't me, right? Only to realize that I had been masking so hard for so long, so completely, that I just had no idea who I was. Even though unmasking isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming visible to everyone, including yourself. And I've talked recently about how hard being visible can be. Because of that, because you're becoming more visible, because you're allowing yourself to be seen in this way and to work within your capacity, there are a lot of shifts that go on in your relationships because you start really considering how available you are. You start shifting your communication style. You start watching your energy output and being more careful about where you spend your executive functioning because you know it's a limited resource. Your social tolerance often goes down and you start putting up boundaries, and boundaries look mean to people when you've been someone who's always said yes and who's always been there for everybody no matter what. When you start holding those hard edges, people think you're mean or mad at them sometimes. This really isn't a personality change. This is more about you learning where your edges are, because we should all have edges. We shouldn't all be smoothed over. Not everything is meant to go smoothly, even if we really want it to sometimes. I want to make sure I say this very clearly here at the beginning, that struggling in this time is par for the course. And it doesn't mean that you have bad relationships. It's much more that your relationships need renegotiation. And that can be hard, especially when you first start unmasking, because you don't really know sometimes how to negotiate relationships to make them healthier and to have the outcomes you're really looking for. One of the first things that happens when we unmask and when we get our diagnosis or when we identify ourselves as neurodivergent is having that diagnosis speech, right? Having that moment where you want to tell everyone in your life everything that you have learned about how your brain works and what it means to you, and relatedly, what it will mean to them, because you are going to shift likely with this diagnosis. That backfires sometimes. I've had that backfire on several occasions. It's not just because I didn't really need to be explaining my full neurological makeup to everybody to justify what I needed. It often backfires because people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear why you're changing or why you're different. They don't want to accept that sometimes. I have often thought about what it would be like to have that conversation with my mom, who passed away almost a decade ago. Like what it would be like to have that conversation with her about my diagnosis, because I think it would be really hard for her to accept and understand, because it would also impact her vision of herself. And I don't know how open she would be to that change. When you approach this conversation, a framework that I like to suggest is talking about what's changed for you, what you need now, like how your needs have changed, and what you're asking of them, what you want that to look like in the relationship. The difference here is you are really just informing someone of what you need, and you're not trying to seek their approval. You don't need to have somebody else's approval about your diagnosis or how you change or how you start putting up boundaries. You're just informing them that these are some of the shifts that you're going through and what it means to you to do that. A lot of the things that or a handful of the things that you might experience, the most common responses are pushback, people who dismiss you and your experience, and maybe some grief that they're experiencing of, who you used to be and what that means for them. One of the first things that my partner at the time I got my diagnosis said to me as I started putting down boundaries and as I got medicated and I started changing how I was doing things, he said, "You're not happy anymore. You used to be so happy." And then followed that up with, "But you're mean now and mad at me all the time." It's like, well, I'm not mad at you. I'm just not easing things all the time. I'm just holding harder edges, and you're not used to what it means to have somebody who doesn't smooth things over. It takes a lot of energy to smooth things over. If we think about taking a stone and a piece of marble that has a sharp edge on it, the energy it takes to smooth it over to be your countertop is not insignificant, right? The energy it takes for you to be rounded all the time, to make rounded edges, to be soft like that, takes a lot of your energy and a lot of your executive functioning. When you stop wanting to spend it there, it impacts people. They notice. You want to set the foundation. You want to set up the floor of what your relationship needs to function versus what you're hoping it can become. When you have this conversation, sometimes this is a one-time conversation. Sometimes you just talk to somebody once and then things adapt, and that's fabulous. Sometimes, and often with our more profound relationships, like with family, etc., this becomes an ongoing dialogue. This comes to where the harder point of this episode is. Often you need to make decisions about what relationships you're going to repair and which ones you're going to release. I want to say this very carefully, but I also want to say it very poignantly. Not every relationship is going to be worth the work it takes to renegotiate it. And that's a hard thing to accept. Generally, your relationships are going to fall into 3 categories post-diagnosis. You're going to adapt to them, you're going to renegotiate them with the person, or you're going to grieve them. Signs a relationship can survive through this is when you have that initial conversation, if the person is curious, if they are flexible, if they're understanding, and if the relationship already has a history of rupture and repair. If you've fixed things before between the two of you, the likelihood that you'll be able to adapt and to this new reality, to the new unmasked you, and what that means on your relationship is significant. On the other side of that, signs it probably can't survive are if there's punishment for you setting a boundary, if there's insistence on you performing your masked self, and there's a sense of conditional love. If the condition of you being loved or appreciated or enjoyed by someone is based on you being your masked self, then it's likely that isn't a relationship you're going to be able to repair. It's valid to grieve a relationship that couldn't hold the real you. But it's also not proof that unmasking is wrong in any way. Working toward that genuine self is the goal, and working toward a life that supports that self is absolutely what we should all be aiming for. It's hard. I say that a lot. I say that a lot of the things that I talk about in this podcast are hard, and these are hard things to do. We're talking about how your brain works and changing how you respond to how your brain works. This is profound stuff. When we're looking at some of these relationships, we can't burn every relationship down. Some relationships are not optional. Family often is not optional, and your professional relationships, like with your boss and your coworkers, these aren't things that you can just toss a bomb on and say, hey, I'm this whole new person. It has to be handled with a little bit more care and a lot more intention. I will plug here that intentional masking is still valid. There are times when you can choose to mask. What you need to recognize is the energy that it takes in order for you to smooth over those corners, in order to present that masked self. And it is required sometimes, it is necessary. When you're looking to at some of those relationships that aren't optional, I want you to think about reducing your investment in them and having that not being the same thing as declaring war. You don't have to completely bomb the situation. You can let relationships shrink or start putting less energy into them without formally ending them. You can put less of your self-worth in the identity you present, both to your family and at work. I know that a lot of people are probably listening to this and hearing that and saying, but, because we live in a capitalist society that values your labor above all else. But you can start to move and shift that and recognize that all of your self-worth doesn't have to come from your labor. And all of your self-worth doesn't have to come from how you labor to support your family. So I'll let that one sit there with you for a minute. When we're talking about family, in some of the family contexts, it is important to think about how you can approach things like holidays or family gatherings with some emotional distance, being able to say, I am in this space, I am going to be who I am, and I am going to hopefully be aware of my past patterns and mindfully negotiate and move around and with those expectations. It can be hard, but you can do it. In professional context, it's important to stay cordial, but that doesn't mean you have to be close, right? The neurodivergent tendency to share, to have, a work wife or a work husband or a work best friend, to have those sort of intimate connections at work aren't necessarily necessary to you being effective in that environment. So that's something to pay attention to as well. You're allowed to tell less than the full truth without lying. Like, you don't have to be your full, authentic, genuine self in every context. And that might be something that is akin to masking, but isn't exactly the same. Because just sort of being more reserved in how you present yourself versus going in and actively trying to make things better by performing a self that the people you're with identify with and can relate to is different from you just pulling back and being a little easier on yourself about how you are in that situation. The longer story here is that some relationships will survive this and some don't. And that's a hard truth sometimes, but it is the basis of this. If this resonated, if this is something you're brushing up against now, you're to the point where you're started to peel back the layers of your mask and you're starting to realize that not all your relationships are embracing that to the degree. Your next step isn't to try to fix every relationship in your life. It's not to realize that like everything needs to be modified immediately in that neurodivergent, everything has to happen right away way. It is to be mindful, to be attentive, to look at what relationships deserve repair and which ones deserve release, and to allow yourself to consider those questions. If you're interested in working through this in a more structured way, coaching with me might be the right next step. Book a Make It Make Sense call. The link to do that is in the show notes. Remember, you're not the villain in this story, but you might be the antagonist to someone else's comfort. Those are not the same thing, and you are allowed to be okay with that.